On a bitter, overcast Sunday in November 1944, deep within the stone walls of the St. Jude's cloister in the Sudets Mountains, a 52-year-old nun named Sister Helena Wysocka stood over a heavy cast-iron cauldron. She was stirring a thick, creamy potato leek soup destined for the dining hall where 48 elite SS commanders sat waiting. The kitchen was filled with the earthy scent of rosemary and wood smoke, but beneath the rhythmic swirl of her wooden spoon lay a dark secret. Stashed inside the hem of her heavy wool habit was a concentrated extract of belladonna and cyanide. In 90 minutes, she would execute a strike that would decapitate the local Nazi command, and then she would be forced to vanish forever. Helena wasn't a partisan fighter or saboteur. She was a woman who had spent 3 decades behind these walls in total devotion to peace. She had never touched a weapon or harbored a grudge. But on this Sunday, Sister Helena decided that divine mercy required a lethal intervention. You see, for 4 years, these men had turned her sanctuary into a blood-stained headquarters. The turning point didn't come from a grand speech, but from a single moment of horror involving a young refugee at the convent gates. That morning, Helena realized that her silence wasn't a virtue, it was a shield from monsters. If the heavens remained silent while the innocent bled, she would become the hand of judgment herself. By the time the final course was served, 48 of the Reich's most brutal officers would be dead, and the world would never even know her name. This is how a woman of God chose to lose her soul to save her country. Before the war came crashing through the gates, St. Jude's cloister was a place where time moved differently. Perched on a rocky outcrop in the Sudets Mountains, the convent had stood for nearly 400 years, its gray stone walls weathered by centuries of wind and snow. Sister Helena Wysocka had arrived there in 1914, a young woman of 22 fleeing a broken engagement and seeking something eternal. She found it in the rhythm of prayer, in the silent hours before dawn when she would kneel in the chapel, and in the simple work of the convent kitchen where she learned to transform humble ingredients into meals that sustained body and spirit. For 30 years, Helena's life followed the same sacred pattern. Morning prayers at 4, breakfast preparation at 5, Mass at 7, kitchen work until evening vespers, then more prayer, and sleep in a narrow cell with a single window overlooking the mountains. She had taken a vow of obedience, and she had honored it without question. The world outside changed dramatically during those decades, but inside these walls, everything remained constant. Helena grew from a young woman into middle age, her hands becoming rougher, her back a little stiffer, but her faith never wavering. Then came September 1939, and the world she knew was incinerated in a matter of weeks. The German Wehrmacht swept through Poland like a scythe through wheat. The nuns heard the distant thunder of artillery, saw the smoke rising from villages in the valleys below. They prayed harder, believing that surely God would spare this holy place. They were wrong. On a cold morning in October, 3 SS officers arrived at the gates with a document bearing official seals. The convent was being requisitioned. St. Jude's cloister would now serve as a rest facility for senior SS commanders rotating out of the Eastern Front. The Mother Superior protested, but the officer in charge simply smiled and informed her that resistance would result in the immediate execution of every nun in the building. 23 sisters lived at St. Jude's. They had no choice. The SS moved in that same afternoon. The transformation was swift and brutal. The chapel was converted into an officer's lounge, complete with a bar and gramophone. The dormitory became sleeping quarters for the commanders. The library was turned into a planning room where maps of the Eastern Territories were spread across tables that had once held illuminated manuscripts. The nuns were relegated to a small section of the building, cramped into what had been storage rooms. They were allowed to continue their prayers, but only in whispers, and only during hours that didn't disturb the officers. Helena and 5 other sisters were assigned to the kitchen. They would cook, they would serve, they would clean, and they would be invisible. That word became their survival strategy: invisible. The SS officers treated them exactly like furniture, like the tables and chairs in the dining hall. When Helena brought a platter of roasted pork to the table, the men would continue their conversations as if she didn't exist. They discussed operational details, casualty figures, deportation schedules, all while she stood 3 feet away, pouring wine into their glasses. At first, Helena told herself this was a test of faith. God was asking her to endure, to serve even those who had defiled his house. She would be the good servant, the obedient daughter. But as months turned into years, what she overheard in that dining hall began to crack something fundamental inside her. These weren't just soldiers following orders, these were architects of atrocities. She heard them laugh about villages burned to the ground. She heard them complain about the inefficiency of certain execution methods. She heard one officer describe shooting a group of children as casually as another man might describe swatting flies. And through it all, Helena remained silent. She poured the wine, she cleared the plates, she returned to the kitchen and scrubbed the pots until her knuckles bled. At night, she would kneel in her cramped room and beg God to show her the meaning of this suffering. Why had he brought these monsters to his house? Why did he allow them to live in comfort while innocent people died in the forests and fields beyond these walls? The other nuns began to break. Sister Marguerite, who had worked alongside Helena for 15 years, started speaking to shadows. Sister Therese developed a nervous tremor that made it impossible for her to hold a serving tray without spilling. The Mother Superior aged 20 years in the span of 2, her face becoming gaunt and hollow. But Helena endured. She kept her head down, kept her hands busy, and tried to convince herself that this was what obedience required. And then came the morning that shattered everything. November 17th, 1944. Helena woke before dawn, as always, dressed in her habit, and made her way to the kitchen. Through the window, she could see fresh snow covering the courtyard, pristine and white. She was preparing the morning bread when she heard voices outside, sharp and aggressive. She moved to the window and looked down into the courtyard. A young woman stood at the gates, maybe 19 or 20 years old, wearing clothes that were little more than rags. Her face was hollow with starvation, her lips cracked and bleeding. She was speaking in Polish, begging for help, explaining that she had escaped from a work camp 30 kilometers away. 2 SS guards stood at the gate, laughing. One of them was eating an apple, taking slow, deliberate bites while the girl pleaded. Helena watched as Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter emerged from the building, still buttoning his uniform jacket. Richter was the senior officer at St. Jude's, a man in his 40s with pale blue eyes and a voice that never rose above a conversational tone even when giving orders for executions. The girl saw him and her pleas became more desperate. She fell to her knees in the snow. Richter listened for perhaps 10 seconds. Then he drew his pistol, placed it against the girl's forehead, and fired.
The sound echoed off the stone walls. The girl crumpled into the snow, blood spreading in a dark halo around her head. Richter holstered his weapon, brushed snow from his sleeve, and turned toward the building. As he passed beneath Helena's window, he called out, "Sister, we'll be ready for breakfast in 30 minutes, and make sure the bread is warm this time."
Helena stood frozen at the window, her hands gripping the sill so hard that splinters drove into her palms. The girl's body lay in the courtyard, steam rising from the blood in the cold morning air. And the man who had killed her was now sitting in the dining hall, waiting for his warm bread. If you can't stand people who treat human life like it's worth less than their morning meal, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments. Type, "Nobody deserves that." Because what happened next only got worse. Something broke inside Helena in that moment. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. For 4 years, she had told herself that obedience was virtue, that suffering was her cross to bear, that God had a plan. But as she stared down at that girl's body, she realized the truth. Her silence wasn't holy, it was complicity. Every meal she prepared for these men was fuel for more murders. Every day she served them was another day they lived while innocents died. The Bible said, "Thou shalt not kill," but it also said, "He who is not with me is against me." By doing nothing, Helena had chosen a side. She had chosen the side of the murderers. That night, while the officers celebrated someone's promotion downstairs, Helena knelt in her cell and made a different kind of prayer. She asked God not for strength to endure, but for forgiveness for what she was about to do. She asked him to take her soul if necessary, because she was willing to trade it. If these men walked free after the war, if they returned to Germany and lived quiet lives with families and grandchildren, then there was no justice in heaven or earth. Helena would become the justice they would never face in a courtroom.
Helena had worked in that kitchen for 4 years. She knew every pot, every pan, every knife. She knew the supply schedules, the meal rotations, the preferences of individual officers. She knew that every Sunday, without exception, all 48 senior officers stationed at St. Jude's were required to attend the formal lunch. It was one of Richter's rules. Sunday lunch was mandatory, a time for the command staff to gather, to discuss the week ahead, to maintain unit cohesion. It was the perfect opportunity. All of them, in one room at one time. The question was method. Helena had no access to weapons. The convent was searched regularly, and any suspicious materials would result in immediate execution. It had to be something they would never suspect, something that could be hidden in plain sight. And then she remembered a conversation from her childhood. Her grandmother had been a midwife in a rural village, and she had told young Helena stories about the plants that grew in the forest. Some could heal, some could kill. Belladonna grew wild in the mountains. Helena had seen it herself during the rare occasion she was allowed to walk the grounds. The berries were deadly, containing atropine that caused paralysis and cardiac arrest. But belladonna alone wouldn't be enough, not for 48 men. She needed something more certain, more immediate. Through careful questions to a supply driver who delivered vegetables to the kitchen, Helena learned that cyanide salts were used in the nearby silver mines for ore processing. The driver, a Czech man who despised the Germans, understood what she was asking without her saying it directly.
2 weeks later, He left a small cloth pouch hidden in a sack of potatoes. Helena spent the next 3 weeks preparing. She harvested belladonna berries during her morning walks, crushing them into a thick paste using a mortar and pestle in the early hours before anyone else woke. She tested small amounts on rats in the cellar, learning the correct dosage. The cyanide she kept wrapped and hidden in the hem of her habit, exactly where she could reach it. She also prepared for escape. Helena studied the convent's layout with new eyes. There was a drainage tunnel in the cellar, built centuries ago to prevent flooding. It hadn't been used in decades and was partially collapsed, but Helena spent her free moments clearing it, stone by stone, moving in absolute silence. The tunnel led to a ravine half a kilometer from the convent. If she could reach it, she might have a chance. Finally, she prepared her soul. Every night, Helena prayed for the people these men had killed, for the girl in the snow, for all the innocents whose names she would never know. She prayed for her own damnation, because she understood that what she was about to do would send her to hell. But if hell was the price for removing 48 murderers from the world, she would pay it gladly. Sunday, November 19, 1944. Helena woke at 3 in the morning, 2 hours earlier than usual. She dressed carefully, making sure the small pouch of cyanide was secured in her hem. She walked to the kitchen in darkness, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The other kitchen sisters wouldn't arrive for another hour. She had time. The menu for Sunday lunch was always the same: potato leek soup, roasted venison, root vegetables, dark bread, and apple strudel for dessert. The soup was Helena's specialty, a rich, creamy blend that the officers particularly enjoyed. Richter had once told her it reminded him of his mother's cooking. Helena had smiled and thanked him. Now she was going to use that recipe to kill him. She began with the soup base, working mechanically through the familiar steps: dicing potatoes, slicing leeks, sautéing them in butter until they were soft and fragrant, adding stock, cream, herbs. The kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of a meal that had been prepared in this space for centuries. As the soup simmered, Helena crushed the belladonna paste and mixed it with the cyanide powder, creating a concentrated solution that dissolved completely in liquid. The other sisters arrived and began their work on the other courses. They noticed nothing unusual about Helena. She had become very good at hiding her thoughts behind a mask of serene obedience. At 11 o'clock, the soup was ready. Helena took it off the heat and set it aside to cool slightly. At 11:30, the officers began filing into the dining hall. She could hear their voices, their laughter, the scraping of chairs. At 11:40, when no one was looking, Helena added the poison to the soup. She stirred it carefully, watching the clear liquid disappear into the creamy broth. Her hands were steady. She felt no fear, no hesitation. This was simply a task that needed to be done. If you believe that evil men shouldn't get to live peaceful lives after committing atrocities, hit that subscribe button. People like Richter won't, and you need to hear what she did about it. At 12 o'clock precisely, Helena and Sister Therese carried the soup tureen into the dining hall. 48 officers sat at the long tables, dressed in their finest uniforms. Richter sat at the head table, looking relaxed and confident. The war might be turning against Germany, but here, in this moment, these men felt untouchable. They were the elite, the chosen, the master race. They had no idea they were sitting at their own funeral. Helena began serving, moving from officer to officer with practiced efficiency. She ladled the soup into bowls, the steam rising, the aroma making several men comment approvingly. Richter complimented her again. She smiled and nodded. One officer made a crude joke about Polish cooking, and the others laughed. Helena moved like a ghost among them, invisible, beneath notice, exactly as she had been for 4 years. When every bowl was filled, the officers raised their spoons and began to eat.
Helena returned to the kitchen, her part complete. Sister Therese began preparing the next course, unaware that there would be no need for it. Helena stood at the window, looking out at the mountains, and waited. Cyanide acts quickly, but belladonna takes longer. Helena had calculated the dosage carefully. The cyanide would begin affecting their systems within 10 to 15 minutes, causing dizziness, confusion, difficulty breathing. The belladonna would intensify these effects, causing paralysis and cardiac arrest. Some men would die quickly, others would take longer, but all of them would die. She heard it begin at 12:17, a chair scraping, a voice calling out in confusion, then another voice, more urgent, then shouting. Helena closed her eyes and continued to pray. The chaos built rapidly. Officers were stumbling, falling, gasping for air. Some managed to make it to the door before collapsing. Others died at the table, face down in their soup bowls. A few had enough strength to draw their weapons, but they were firing blind, hitting walls and windows, accomplishing nothing. Sister Therese ran to the dining hall to see what was happening, then screamed and ran back to the kitchen, her face white with terror. Helena took her by the shoulders, looked directly into her eyes, and told her in a calm voice that God's judgment had come to St. Jude's cloister and that Therese needed to gather the other sisters and flee immediately. Therese fled. Helena remained. She listened as the shouting turned to groans and the groans turned to silence. It took 72 minutes from the first spoonful to the last breath. Helena counted every minute. She owed them that much, the men who were dying by her hand. She wouldn't hide from what she had done. When silence finally fell over the dining hall, Helena walked through the kitchen one last time. She removed her apron, folded it carefully, and placed it on the counter. Then she descended to the cellar, crawled into the drainage tunnel, and began the long, dark journey to freedom.
The tunnel was worse than Helena remembered. Water had seeped through the stone, creating pools of freezing mud. The passage was so narrow in places that she had to squeeze through sideways, the rough stone tearing at her habit. She couldn't see anything, navigating purely by touch, pulling herself forward inch by inch. The air was thick with the smell of rot and stagnant water. It took 3 hours to travel half a kilometer. When Helena finally emerged into the ravine, it was mid-afternoon and starting to snow. She was covered in mud and filth, her habit torn, her hands bleeding, but she was alive and she was outside the walls. She knew she had to move quickly. When the bodies were discovered, the Germans would lock down the entire region. They would search every building, every forest, every cave. They would execute anyone suspected of helping her. Helena couldn't go to any of the nearby villages. She would have to survive in the wilderness and make her way west toward the advancing Allied forces. For 14 days, Helena walked through the mountains. She moved at night, hiding during the day in abandoned barns and hollow trees. She had no food except what she could scavenge from frozen fields, rotten turnips, half-frozen apples, once a dead rabbit that she ate raw because she couldn't risk a fire. The November cold was brutal, and her torn habit provided little protection. She developed a fever that made her hallucinate, seeing the faces of the dead officers in the snow, hearing their voices calling her name. On the 7th night, she stumbled onto a patrol. 3 German soldiers, young men barely out of their teens, sitting around a small fire. One of them saw her and raised his rifle. Helena stood perfectly still, waiting for the shot. But then the soldier lowered his weapon. Perhaps he saw only a half-frozen nun. Perhaps he was tired of killing. Perhaps God intervened. The soldier told her to walk away, and she did. On the 14th night, Helena reached a ridge overlooking a valley. In the distance, she could see lights, vehicles moving in an organized convoy, Allied forces, British from the markings she could make out. She began making her way down the slope, slipping on ice, falling, getting up, falling again. At dawn, she collapsed at a checkpoint. British soldiers found her, this filthy, delirious woman muttering in Polish. They took her to a field hospital, where a doctor examined her and declared it a miracle she was alive. She had severe frostbite, malnutrition, pneumonia, and infected wounds across her hands and arms. Helena spent 3 weeks in that hospital, drifting in and out of consciousness. When she finally woke fully, a British intelligence officer was sitting beside her bed. He told her that St. Jude's cloister had been found with 48 dead SS officers, that the Germans had blamed it on a partisan attack, that the convent had been burned to the ground in retaliation. He asked Helena what she knew about it. Helena looked at him for a long moment, then told him she had escaped during the chaos and knew nothing about how the officers died. The British officer studied her face, then nodded slowly. He told her that sometimes God worked in mysterious ways, and that perhaps some mysteries were best left unsolved. When the war ended, Helena made her way back to Poland. The Mother Superior and most of the other sisters had survived by fleeing to a village church. They welcomed Helena back with tears and prayers, never asking what had happened during those final hours at St. Jude's. Perhaps they guessed. Perhaps they chose not to know. Helena requested a transfer to a small, remote convent near Krakow, a place where she could live in genuine silence. She was granted the transfer. She spent the next 32 years in that convent, rarely speaking, spending her days in prayer and her nights staring out at the stars. She never told her story to anyone. She carried the weight of 48 deaths alone, offering those souls to God every single day and asking Him to judge whether she had acted as His instrument or His betrayer. In her final years, Helena's health declined rapidly. The frostbite from her escape had done permanent damage, and her lungs never fully recovered from the pneumonia. Sister Helena Wysocka died in 1977 at the age of 85. She was buried in a simple grave with a plain wooden cross. The official cause of death was respiratory failure. Only one detail marked her as unusual. In her final confession, given to a young priest who had never heard of St. Jude's cloister, she asked to be forgiven for taking 48 lives and prayed that the girl in the snow would understand that Helena had tried to make it right. The young priest, confused, wrote down the confession and filed it away. It wasn't until 1991, when British intelligence declassified files from the war, that Helena's story came to light. Investigators found a reference to a nun who had been found near Allied lines in late 1944, suffering from exposure and malnutrition, who insisted she knew nothing about the mass death at St. Jude's cloister. Further investigation connected the dots to Sister Helena Wysocka, a nun who served at St. Jude's and later transferred to a convent near Krakow, where she died in 1977. The files also contained a note from the British intelligence officer who had interviewed her in the hospital. It read, "This woman knows exactly what happened at St. Jude's. I believe she is responsible for the deaths of 48 SS officers. I also believe she is one of the bravest people I have ever met. I have marked this file for permanent sealing." The file was unsealed anyway, decades later, and Helena's story entered the historical record. But by then, everyone who had known her was long dead. The girl in the snow had no name, no grave, no one to remember her. The 48 officers were footnotes in histories of the war, their deaths attributed to unknown causes in most official records. But Helena's story survived. A woman who spent 30 years devoted to peace, who took a vow never to harm, who believed in mercy and forgiveness, made the choice to become an executioner. She traded her soul for justice, or what she believed was justice. She killed 48 men, then spent the rest of her life praying for forgiveness, never knowing if God would grant it. History can't tell us if Helena made the right choice. Faith can't tell us if she was an angel or a murderer. All we can say with certainty is that on a Sunday in November 1944, a 52-year-old nun looked at the bodies of innocent people, looked at the men responsible, and decided that silence was no longer an option. If you watched or listened up to this point, comment the country you were watching this from. Represent your country. Sister Helena Wysocka lived in obscurity and died in silence. But her story remains, a testament to the impossible choices war forces upon ordinary people and the weight those choices leave behind. She saved no one. She avenged no one. She simply ensured that 48 men who had treated human life as worthless would never get the chance to forget what they had done. Whether that was justice or murder, salvation or damnation, is a question Helena took to her grave, and perhaps that's where it belongs.